I'd like to welcome everyone who's joined us online to celebrate and notice the publication, this new Mapping Medea, Revolutions and Transfers 1750 to 1800, edited by Anna Albrektson and our own APGRD's Fiona Macintosh. The very first book that the APGRD ever published in 2000 was this, Medea in Performance 1500 to 2000, edited by the usual suspects. It was published in the Legenda series, which is a modern language series, and that was our very first publication. So we've come back, we've circled back to Medea, but with a very different book. And in the meantime, the APGRD has published a whole shelf of books, and nearly all of them published by OUP and published to very high standards, fortunately, though, of course, that also means high prices. And nearly all of them, like that first Medea one, 1500 to 2000, diachronic and covering, as well as covering a wide geographical range, covering a wide chronological range, with the exception of Dionysus since 69, which was entirely devoted to the last 30 or 40 years before its publication, not all that long after 2000. So I will introduce the batting order, if people don't mind cricketing terminology, and tell you who's going to be speaking, and then we can just have a sequence without my interrupting it. Firstly, we're very glad to have here from Melbourne, so the cricketing terminology will go down all right, Miranda Stanyon, who is the co-director and research fellow in the School of Culture and Communication there in Melbourne. She works on Enlightenment and Romantic era literature in Britain and Germany, and takes the comparative approach to aesthetics as a way of constructing post-Enlightenment human subject and relationship with nature. She's the author of a book, Resounding the Sublime, Music in English and German Literature and Aesthetic Theory, 1670 to 1850. So Miranda will go first, and then she will be followed by Kate Tunstall, who is a colleague here in Oxford at Worcester College, a professor of French, and her expertise is particularly perhaps in the literary history of French 18th century, especially the works of Diderot. She is interested, and a very interesting subject I think it is too, in literary materiality, the actual act of publication, querelle, and questions of contextualization. She's published a book, Blindness and Enlightenment, and is an editor or co-editor of several books and journals, including Women and Querelles, if that's right, or Women and Quarrels in early modern France, which is quite recent. Miranda and Kate, who are both responding to the book, will go first. And then Anna, the co-editor, Anna Albrektson, will respond. She has often been to visit us in Oxford because she's been researching on Medea in the 18th century, in 18th century culture, and this book is particularly the second half of the 18th century. She is a professor at Stockholm University. She was, before that, she was at Uppsala. It was during visits to Oxford that she and Fiona got together and came up with conference and this publication. And then finally, after Anna, Fiona is, the tail ender, the night watchman. Then we hope that some of the contributors to the book are online, and they will be free to contribute to the discussion first. And then anyone who wants to raise a question, please would you send it in either to the chat or by email to the APGRD. If we have time before the stumps are drawn, we'll have an open discussion. And I should say, by the way, that this is being recorded, but we'll record it as far as the contributions of the contributors, and we won't record the open discussion. So it doesn't matter if you say something incriminating. So that is our lineup, and I will then I will ask Miranda, who has very nobly got up at an unearthly hour, well before dawn, to contribute. I'll ask Miranda to start us off. Miranda Stanyon.
Good morning, or good start of the evening. It's such a pleasure to join everyone and to celebrate this wonderful book with you all. And a special thank you to Oliver for that introduction, to Fiona and Anna for extending the invitation. I'm speaking to you, as Oliver said, from Melbourne, the traditional land of the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people. And I want to acknowledge that this land was never ceded and pay respects to elders past, present and future. The first recorded performance of Medea in Australia seems to have been a one-act burlesque by Robert Brough called Medea, or the Best of Mothers with a Brute of a Husband. It was performed alongside Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew in Newcastle, our Newcastle, founded on the land of the Awabakal and Worimi peoples. The year was 1870, 16 years after Brough's burlesque had premiered in London. This rather low-key landmark in Medea's global receptions resonates with a number of the key insights articulated so strongly in Mapping Medea, and that I want to touch on in this response. So first, that genre, the burlesque by Brough, is a genre where Medea had been active since the late 18th century, as Edith Hall observes, and one which forms one strand in this figure's media crossing and genre testing exertions, alongside melodrama, ballet d'action, puppet theatre, and more traditional genres, of course, undergoing their own changes in the period: opera, drama, poetry of various kinds, and so on. Second, the burlesque's suggestive pairing with a Shakespearean domestic comedy, The Taming of the Shrew, might make us think of the elective affinities in the second half of the 18th century between Medea and Shakespearean tragedies. These affinities, Fiona Macintosh shows in her chapter in the volume, gathered around the cruel mother of Lady Macbeth and also around the aesthetic of the sublime. Fiona's chapter makes clear that Medea's post-Baroque flourishing relied in a strong part on Pseudo-Longinus' sublime, so that the outdated or seemingly outdated Baroque aesthetic of the marvellous and spectacular could be replaced by something more fit or more tractable for the period. The overlap between these two categories, the way that one might territorialize another, was signalled already in Boileau's landmark translation of Longinus in 1674, which Boileau called "of the sublime" or "of the marvellous" in discourse. A resistance to spectacle, to high style, and to representation were already strands of the 17th century sublime. And by 1757, Burke will regard obscurity as a key source of sublime terror. The mind swelling to fill in gaps, as it's prone to do, and not finding any boundaries in what it's shown with an obscure object, it can expand its sense of horror, of fear, of immensity, or of guilt ad infinitum. And I thought of the sublime not only in reading Macintosh's chapter, but also Zoe Schweitzer's essay in this volume on infanticide. It ponders, among other things, the dark side of sensibility, a real key term for this volume, as you might expect. Schweitzer suggests the potential sadism, voyeurism, or voluptuous pleasure attaching to apparently pathos-filled and almost sanitized versions of Medea, like Glover's play of 1761. Glover pointedly doesn't show Medea's infanticide and practices what Schweitzer calls a poetics of frustration, or we might say of murky, sublime, or incipiently sublime obscurity, as he slowly lets us and Medea know that the children have in fact been murdered. Glover gives one window into the extremely complex histories told by Medea about interiority, psychology or psychologization, and the value of conflicting passions in the period, subjects that are also key to chapters by Georg Griemer Edith Hall and others. And Kremer points to a really nice moment when Lessing in the Laocoon praises, quote, a painter for taking Medea not at the moment when she really murders her children, but a few moments before, when maternal love is still struggling with jealousy, that kind of attachment to the mixed motives of Medea. And we might think too of Schiller's essay on the pathetic on this point, a couple of decades later, when he writes that, quote, in killing her children, Medea aims at Jason's heart, but she simultaneously strikes a painful blow against her own, and her revenge becomes aesthetically sublime as soon as we see the tender mother. Now to my third reflection, returning to Medea, or the best of mothers with a brute of a husband. Brough apparently nodded to Euripides and the Argonautica in his burlesque, but not to Seneca, bearing witness to the influence of later 18th century as what the editors of this volume call a pivotal moment in the reception of Medea, when the Senecan Medea begins to cede ground permanently to Euripides' version, as she contributes to the early discourse around the woman question, end quote. Thus, the sort of Senecan witch demi-goddess who may have delighted Baroque audiences becomes in many cases a problem, even an embarrassment, as Roland Liseld puts it, in relation to the poet Klinger's in some ways backward-looking Baroque-inflected Medea in Corinth of 1787. And I should say that Klinger is really treated in brilliant ways in a number of these essays. Euripides' more human Medea becomes a solution to the problem of the kind of Baroque or supernatural trappings of the figure. Although essays by Larissa Nikiforova on the Russian context and on Antony John Lappin on Spain, Portugal, and the New World also really underscore that Baroque spectacularism and the supernatural were not perceived as problematic in the same way or at the same time in different cultures. In Russia, for instance, a wise maiden tradition could cross-fertilize the Medea myth and even also feed into imaginings of Medea as a figure of power, as a political ruler with quasi-supernatural or allegorically imagined supernatural powers. And on Lappin's reading in Spain, quote, an increased emphasis on magic in the Medea myth staged a kind of resistance to the stress in Spanish neoclassicism on, quote, the verisimilitudinous, the rational, and the underlightingly didactic. A fourth brief reflection before I hand over to Kate, coming back one more time to Brough and Medea as the best of mothers. This work's spoofy styling of Medea as an idealized and victimized mother speaks really strongly to the effectiveness of sentimental rewritings of Medea in the Age of Sensibility. This chimes with the introduction's claim, reinforced by a number of chapters, that, quote, it is between 1750 and 1800 that contemporary understandings of Medea emerge. And yet, and perhaps this is something that others will want to speak to, the sense also emerges from the collection that the Medeas of 1750 to 1800 are not contemporary or modern in any straightforward sense. The humanized, psychologized, more domesticated Medea indeed may become dated quite quickly after the terror, with the demise of sensibility, and with what the introduction calls, quote, the entrance of a modern Medea, a different modern Medea, no longer idealized victim of the late 18th century, but again the exile, haunted by demonic and material forces. Lisel, in his meditation on the return of the repressed sorceress figure, suggests that we get a taste of this kind of modern Medea with Franz Grillparz's post-romantic 1821 play. Part of Grillparz's trilogy Das Goldene Vlies, The Golden Fleece, this play is, quote, light years away from the sentimental Medea of the late 18th century. Quote, with Grillparzer, we enter the realm of the 20th century. Largely, or at least strongly, because we meet a heroine who is more emphatically an exile and an ethnic other. Pushing this interpretation a little, I wondered whether we might say that Grillparz's Medea and Jason can seem modern in a sense, because as post-revolutionary, post-Napoleonic characters, they struggle and fail to become the moderate, rational, but tender individuals of modernity. They fail to get over the powers of violence, irrationality, and the superhuman but hardly moral acts of daring seen in the ancient myth. Powers that are symbolized by a literally buried and later exhumed chest holding Medea's staff and the banner of the Golden Fleece. In other words, Grillparz's Medea might feel in some ways modern insofar as she struggles to be modern in an enlightened sense, enshrined by stadial history. That is, those stages of social development from savagery to barbarism to civilization to commercial society that 18th century history writing presented as inevitable, natural, and linear. So Anna Albrektson shows in her searching essay in this volume that critiques of Western masculine progress critiques of this stadial model could surface not only in the trope of the noble savage that we know so well, but also in what she calls the trope of the inverted barbarian, a civilized European barbarian, drawing on the contrast between the ethical barbarian and the ethnic barbarian, and on Euripides' own use of those terms in Medea. Albrektson argues that for a relatively short period in the 1770s and 80s, the, quote, ethical barbarian becomes visible in aspects of portrayals of the adventurer Jason as, quote, the cruel and inhuman father, lover, or ex-hero. While Medea definitely does not escape the charge of barbarism in this period, it's Jason who parallels the barbaric aristocratic predator, who's critiqued elsewhere, the barbaric colonial slave owner, or the political tyrant. Albrektson suggests that the terror and the demise of sensibility put an end to the strength of this particular theme in Medea receptions. The pressure put on stadial history by the revolution, which made it clear, or seemed to make it clear, that history wasn't simply progressing forward, becoming more civilized, coincides with what Albrektson analyzes as an emerging 19th century racial paradigm, according to which Medea's barbarity is increasingly understood as inborn and unchangeable, not ethical. And so perhaps something which emerges from this really powerful collection and its period of focus is not the Medea of modernity or let alone of contemporary life, but rather a group of not thoroughly modern Medeas, figures who by their sort of modernness, their different kinds of modernness, might help us to continue to reflect on the ways we conjure with categories such as gender, ethnicity, territory and belonging, violence and its sublimation, aesthetics and ethics. In this spirit, and in the spirit of Medea's global transfers and elective affinities, I'd like to close with one strange resonance for me of this collection's brilliant cover image of a red, black and gold-clad Medea, taken from a costume design by Fesch for a staging of Lully's Thésée, staged much later in the 1770s or 80s. The rich collection in this, the rich essay, I'm sorry, on costume in this collection by Petra Dotplachilova made me speculate that the red and gold of Medea here would suggest to audiences Medea's nobility or royalty, while the black points to her magical powers. And yet, after a few weeks of sitting on my desk, I realized that for me, this color combination was summoning up the red, gold, and black of the Australian Aboriginal flag, and was putting me in mind of a play I'm increasingly eager to see and to think about in light of this collection by the Indigenous playwright Wesley Enoch, his Black Medea of 2000. As, quote, a reimagining of Euripides with an Indigenous woman at its centre, where the quest for the Golden Fleece is replaced by an Indigenous Jason's quest for mining rights in Medea's hometown, in Medea's home area. Enoch's play sits in a crucial reception tradition that's illuminated by a number of this volume's essays that shows Medea's entanglements with the politics of extraction, annexation, and empire in the long 18th century. I'm sure that the collection will have other resonances and spark other kinds of ponderings from many other readers. And so I just want to conclude by saying another congratulations to all the contributors to this many-sided volume. I know Mapping Medea will provide illumination and food for thought for many in the months and years to come. And I'll hand over now to Kate.
Thanks, Miranda. Let me just make my screen. Can you hear me? I'm taking that as a yes. So thank you very much, Fiona, for the invitation to respond to this book, and to thank Fiona and Anna and all of the contributors for writing it. Let me say at the outset how much I enjoyed reading it. I learnt masses of new things, and it's also a really nice object to hold in your hand. It's a really nice weight. It's got lovely paper. It smells great. So, so thank you. And then, so how best to respond to it? So I wanted to start with a confession, which is that when it comes to Medea, I have never seen it and not had a huge row afterwards with the man I went to see it with. I've seen it 3 times, and the biggest row I think was following the performance with Fiona Shaw back in 2002. I think I tend in general to agree with Jean-Jacques Rousseau when he said in the Lettres to d'Alembert, he said of the theatre in the Lettres d'Alembert in 1758, that theatre doesn't so much purge the passions as stir them up. And in my experience, that is particularly true of Medea. It's a dangerous play. So when I say rows, I mean really raging rows, the ones you have when you're absolutely at your most vulnerable. So when Fiona asked me to say a few words at the launch of a new book called Mapping Medea, I was delighted. I should also say it made sense to me. The first APGRD event I ever went to was the 1998 Medea conference at, I think it was at Somerville, which became the book Medea in Performance that Oliver held up a moment ago, edited by Oliver, Fiona and Edith Hall, who I think is also in this call, and who has a piece in this volume. So I'm here in my capacity as, I think, a long-standing supporter and admirer of the work of the APGRD, and as one ravaged by performances of Medea. I'm also a scholar of the Enlightenment and of the French 18th century more broadly, and it's mostly, you'll be happy to hear, in that capacity that I want to respond to Mapping Medea. And I want to say, I think, 3 short things. So one is an observation about the bourgeois Medea, or the disenchanted Medea, I think I want to call her, or call it, I think I want to call the play. One is a question, think about costume, and one is a question about mapping. So let me start with mapping. So the book's called Mapping Medea. And I don't simply want to note, though I think we ought to note, the very remarkable geographical range that the book covers. So Lisbon, London, Leipzig, Sao Paulo, St. Petersburg, Paris, Moscow, Venice. It's not only to note that, though I think it's extremely noteworthy. It's also to wonder whether some of what's being mapped here, insofar as some of the cases we're dealing with are French playwrights or choreographers or costumiers, some of it, of what's being mapped, is what we might think of as the extent of French soft power. So I haven't had time to cross-reference Mapping Medea with Staging Civilization, which is Raoul Markowitz's recent book on 18th century French cultural imperialism. And if I recall, the repertoire that he observes in that book mostly involves gallantry, so la galanterie. But I think it would be interesting to know whether the exporting of, say, Nevers ballet could be understood as part of a practice of soft power. So that's kind of my first question. Could we think of some of these 18th century Médées as pandas in the sense of cultural diplomacy, you know, like panda diplomacy? They're obviously less cuddly than galanterie and than pandas, but was Médée part of this kind of soft power repertoire? And if not, how did it relate to that repertoire? Did it relate to that repertoire at all? So I suppose it's about the possible Frenchiness of Medea and a role in cultural export. Then my second thing is about a particular Medea that appears on a number of occasions in the book, and it's Jean-Marie Bernard Clément's Medea, which was published and performed in 1779. So that turns up on a number of occasions in this book in really interesting ways. And it's an instance of an invention of the second half of the 18th century of what appears as, or is named in the book as, a bourgeois sentimental Medea. And Fiona and Anna in their introduction acknowledge that it might be a bit counterintuitive, which I thought was absolutely right. So Clément's Medea is a devoted wife and loving mother. She's driven by an unfaithful and ungrateful husband with a barbaric heart to the most extreme acts of self-harm, in which, in a moment of diminished responsibility and mental alienation, she kills her own children, and when she realizes what she's done, she kills herself. So Clément's Medea is a kind of self-sacrificing figure who never gets to say me. I mean, she does say the word moi, but it's not the monosyllabic claim to autonomy that it is in either Seneca or Corneille. So she talks of being hors de moi-même, so out of herself. She tries to avoid herself. She talks about éviter le spectacle de moi-même. And that is a Medea, if I'm allowed to say, that leaves me cold. And I want to blame Voltaire for this. C'est la faute à Voltaire, the phrase that is often used in French. Because we have some evidence that Clément wrote his Medea in direct response to Voltaire. There are letters in the Electronic Enlightenment correspondence that appear to make this clear. Clément arrived in Paris from Dijon in 1768, all ready to try and make his fortune as a playwright in the capital, and he wrote to Voltaire and told him that he had written a play that he thought the grand tragedian would appreciate, a Médée non magicienne, so which I would translate as a disenchanted Medea, one that did without gods and without dragons, and it was, I think we can say, like Clément's calling card when he arrived in Paris hoping to make his fortune. And so I think the interesting thing about this is that it took him such a long time to get it performed. So he clearly wrote it in the 1760s, and it's not until 1779 and the performances that are discussed in this volume, so it's not until 1779 that he gets it performed. And in that letter, he confesses to having had some trouble getting anyone else to appreciate it. So, dans ce siècle, he sighed, in this philosophical century, dans ce siècle philosophique, I find people still rather like witches, though they don't believe in them. J'ai trouvé qu'on aimait encore les sorcières sans y croire. So it would take Clément 10 years to get his more believable, or he says, and much less enjoyable play, he acknowledges, to get it performed. And it only lasted one night. So it turns up a lot in this volume for very good and interesting reasons, but actually the performance history would, I think, give it a much smaller place. Clément's Medea was a Medea that robbed the heroine of her mojo, you might say, and of her moi. It was a Medea that was made safe. So the Enlightenment kind of disenchanted, or had a go at disenchanting Medea, domesticated Medea, made her housebound, non-foreign, and gave her as her only means of self-affirmation suicide. So I thought the book was really good at showing the kind of limits of Medea. Was this Medea a kind of category error? Could we really accept this Medea? And it looks as though theatregoers at the time had some some trouble. And Fiona and Anna say in her introduction that, you know, the bourgeois Medea may never really have been a Medea at all. So what we call Medea seemed to be an interesting question in this book. And then finally, I just wanted to note costume. I mean, Miranda's said something about this already, and it's Petra Dotlachilova. Her chapter on visual language, I thought, was extremely interesting, and shows, so there's the picture on the cover that Miranda already spoke about, with the bats on her skirts. And there are also some other pictures in the volume that I think are extremely interesting, not least the ones of the Furies. And I thought maybe just for, I could show you some of these. So can I do this? So there were pictures of Furies that I thought were worth sharing. Can you see this one? As soon as I share them, they disappear from my screen, so it's difficult for me to be able to comment on them. But I thought that one of the things that was very interesting about these also related to the question of travesty, and did we know what the parodies looked like? So travesty also, in that sense, there's a rather wonderful parody that we don't mention in the volume, but I also thought was perhaps worth saying something about here. Can you see that one? Médée Jason, la terrible, ornée. And I wondered whether these were travesties, in fact, of the bouquet costumes. So here we have dance, soupçon, suspicion, noirceur, plaisir, bêtise, horreur, gaieté, trahison, plaisanterie, poison, tabac, poignard, salade, amour, mort, assassinat, and feu d'artifice. And I wondered whether there was more to be found out about costumes and the possible parodies of those costumes, if that's what those might be. And I had a question also about Medea's robe, and that there's quite a lot to say because they're fascinating, about the bats on her robe as they're shown on the cover, and also in some of the other images that there are in the book. But actually the robe that she gives, you know, the poisoned robe, I wondered whether we ever knew what that might look like in the 18th century or indeed 17th century productions. So I had just a question about the history of the performances there, on the basis of those really wonderful pictures that there are in the volume. So I'm not sure that, you know, pandas and disenchantments or parodies of salade were exactly what you were hoping for in a response, but let me say it's a sign of how I thought it was really extremely interesting, and I learned an enormous amount, and thank you very much for inviting me, and well done. I look forward to hearing more about it. Thank you.
So thank you both, Miranda and Kate, for your readings and comments, and you brought up a number of issues of great relevance, and I will try to address at least some of them. But first of all, I would like to thank the APGRD for hosting this event and for its long-standing support of this project. And I must say it's been a privilege working with you, Fiona, and it's been very rewarding to combine your classical reception perspective with the kind of 18th century literary and aesthetic studies I usually work with. And not least, my warmest thanks to the contributors. And I'm so glad to see that some of you are here online tonight. As we mentioned, this volume grew out of a conference held in Uppsala and in Stockholm in 2018. And the conference was part of my project Moving Medea, the transcultural stage in the 18th century, funded by the Swedish foundation called Riksbankens Jubileumsfond. And I'm currently working on a monograph with the title Moving Medea here in Wolfenbüttel. But back to the conference, Fiona Macintosh and Edith were the keynote speakers, and it was an open call. And I'm very happy that the conference addressed so many aspects of the 18th century Medea. And the contributors have brought wide-ranging interdisciplinary expertise into the volume, covering a number of language areas and geographies, as well as different art forms, and plunging into archives and material from different parts of Europe and the colonial world. And thanks to you, the volume brings together much rare material to critical attention for the first time. I would like to highlight a few aspects of the volume, and I will connect to your question about modernity and also about French soft power. But first thing, the time frame. We have tried to combine a synchronic perspective, focusing on the second half of the 18th century, with an awareness of the diachronic perspective inherent in reception studies. And this take is meant to allow for reversed chronologies, as in, for example, the Russian reception of Longe-Pierre, Novaire, and the Gotterbender melodrama. They were introduced to the Russian audience in reverse order, with Gotte's 1777 melodrama. It was staged in Russia from 1781, preceding Longe-Pierre's tragedy from 1697. It was staged in Russia in 1819. So in many chapters, we also note the simultaneity of Baroque Medeas with aesthetically groundbreaking versions all over Europe, both as performance and in print. Longe-Pierre is a good example, since his tragedy was still staged late in the 18th century. And thus this Medea moment, as we call it, includes the past, but also reshapes the past in many ways. And that perhaps could be a comment to the modern Medea. We have a rather complex combination of past and present in this context. On the other hand, it's certainly possible to identify some changes within the short period discussed, as is evident in many chapters, notably Novaire's ballet, Gotte's melodrama, or the radical changes of the 1790s that you, Miranda, mentioned in Klinger's tragedies. And they were putting an end to the humanized Medea of the preceding decades. And as you have also mentioned, we also sent Medea off into the 19th century with Grillparzer. And I think this temporal entanglement is worth noting, especially when combined with the spatial aspects of Medea. And perhaps, as you stated, Miranda, this is a kind of another take on the modern Medea, and sort of making this question of modernity a bit more complex than it might seem in the introduction. Kate, you mentioned French soft power, and perhaps Novaire is actually quite a good example in that sense, because as we mentioned in the introduction, he worked in many parts of Europe, and I would rather see him as a part of this transcultural Europe, and Europe including the colonial world. And it's rather fascinating that his this huge manuscript ended up in Stockholm, because late in his career he applied for a post in Stockholm, and that's the reason one of these very beautifully illustrated manuscripts ended up in Stockholm. So I think he's you could see this idea of French soft power as I think it's a bit too late for French soft power here, because I would say that belongs perhaps more to the early 18th century, and I think these transcultural processes are much more complex. Novair in Stockholm is something different than Novair in Paris, and Novair changes when he moves to Russia and when he moves to London. So we have decided to focus more on sort of the local reception of these figures. And Goethe, for example, he's certainly not French, and his Medea is an example of a of a German bourgeois influence of Medea, of the Medea story in Europe. So that might be a comment to your question about French soft power. I would also like to add that the book is divided into two parts, and the first part concerns Medea in an expanding colonial world, and as you mentioned, ranging from the Russian Empire to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the New World. The second part studies local interpretations and global issues, ontology and form, we call it. I would just like to stress that these two parts are intertwined in many senses. The aesthetic discussion about form is very much part of, for example, Hall's and Lapin's chapters. And many of the local examples of the second part reflect back on the expanding 18th century world, such as the ambiguity inherent in the suppression of violence, characteristic of sentimental drama. You just mentioned Schweitzer's chapter earlier. And I could say the same for Fiona's and Jörg's and Petra's and Roland's chapters. So from this transcultural perspective, the two parts are indeed intertwined. So I think I'll just stop there and hand over to Fiona.
Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you, Miranda, not least for her extraordinary early start and a really incredibly rich response, and to Kate, as ever, for the sharpest eye, I think, in Oxford. So thank you. I want really, I'm aware that we want to hear from the contributors and hopefully some people in the audience. So I just want to say really a couple of things. First of all, it was a complete delight to work with Anna, as you will perhaps have recognized from the chronology. We worked during the pandemic, and I think almost every other Friday we met, and not only was it for me an extraordinary intellectual journey, it was also a great pleasure to get to know Anna at a very difficult time for all of us. So I thank you both intellectually, but also personally. The other thing I just want to say before I hand over is simply, and Oliver alluded to it at the beginning, and Anna picked up in her response, that the importance for reception studies in working on the synchronic level has been incredibly informative for me. And as Anna also pointed out, it is salutary for many people who work in reception to realize what Anna has called reverse reception, and how this is perhaps a moment when the past is being absolutely the agent in the present and shaping responses in quite extraordinary ways. I really want to stop at this point and invite, and I think we have at least 2 or 3 of the contributors online, and I hope they will be able maybe to switch a camera on and say a few words. Please do so. Is anyone going to step up?
I'll step up if nobody else will.
Thank
Also,
you.
Also incredibly short. Reiterate delight or unbelievable conference that was. You and I had such a good time there, Fiona. English Girls Go Scandinavia. It was a superb conference, beautifully organised. But I just want to say I've done so little for this book. You know, I'm just honoured to be in it. For me, watching the whole discipline of performance reception studies develop has been an utter delight. You and I, Fiona, sort of first met, I don't know, 1987 at the first ever classical civilization A-level course in Britain, which I've now realised was actually quite a historic event in terms of British pedagogy, but immediately realised that there was a gigantic hole lurking in scholarship where the performance history of ancient drama existed. And so we started with what, looking back, seemed like really very crude, diachronic, you know, basic pasturage, you know, clearing the land, just trying to get some sort of basic chronologies out there of what had happened, because there was nothing. There was nothing. And once, you know, we got it funded at Oxford, it meant we could go ahead with the database and at least try and sort out some basic fundamental frameworks for research. But what delights me is the sophistication of this book, that it can take a period, you know, a dynamic, pivotal period, it's a completely different approach, and show both how aesthetically interrelated all these different performance arts are, but I think actually more importantly, especially in today's world, that we cannot study theatre history from a national perspective. It just won't do. It really will not do. All these guys in Western and Middle and Eastern Europa, and indeed, as Miranda has said, around the world, are feeding off each other, illuminating each other. And this is, I think, the first, I can't think of another book similarly to, I tried a little tiny weeny bit in my book on Iphigenia in Tauris, but to show how we can't study these things in isolation. People in Paris are talking to people in, you know, parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, are talking to people in Russia, are then affecting people colonized in Georgia. Italian and French opera are in constant dialogue. They're producing new forms. Theatre companies are moving around. And I think there is no such beautifully concentrated case study in existence of that. I think that it actually sets a whole new precedent in sophistication. I don't call it synchronic quite. I don't think it's quite synchronic. I would understand synchronic slightly differently as taking quite a flat year and saying what everything that's going on. It's both synchronic and diachronic, and it's absolutely transcends national boundaries, which is not only intellectually, I think, crucial for this particular period. It is largely around the French Revolution and its general aftermaths, but it's a very important lesson for today's world, where we all have to think far less nationalistically and far more in terms of what keeps us all together. And it's very important to me, for example, that it shows the cultural affinities with Russia.
Thank you, Edith, so much. And I know that I can see on my top bar that Zoe is also on the call. And Zoe, I don't know whether you would like to put your camera on and say something?
Well, thank you so much for the book. I'm so happy to see it now, and that was a very great congress, and we were all delighted to be in Uppsala. But the thing is, I think very interesting the way it's cross reception studies with a reflection as thinking about modernity. That was interesting about. I mean, that's a methodological way of doing the book, which was very interesting, because that was not only transnational borders, which was expected since the beginning, I think, of the project, but that was a way of focusing on a period about and thinking about how we could think about reception without staying in the same borders. That was very interesting for the book. I think for the books that appear today, that was not exactly the same thing when we were at the symposium in Uppsala. And I think you work together to make this aim of the book just appear very clearly. And that was very interesting. And so I think that's about this question of modernity and domesticating media also. That was very interesting to see how this short period was, everybody was trying to do more or less the same in so different ways because of the culture and because of the reception of the antiques also. So I think that was interesting about this methodological point of view about the text and about media. And that's very moving because when I began my PhD, I had the Legenda book, and so well, that's that's very nice to be there today.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Forgive me if there is anyone who's also a contributor, but I can't see, and I know a number of people, not least our classics editor from classics at OUP, Charlotte Loveridge, would have wanted to be with us, but unfortunately Charlotte is stuck on a train somewhere, so can't be with us. So now maybe I'll hand back, if I may, to Oliver, because maybe now is the moment that we could open up to those people on the call who may have some questions.